The desert sun blazed overhead as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across his weathered face. His unit had been searching for 3 days now, combing through the rocky terrain of the mountains that stretched endlessly before them. The mission seemed impossible, but Marcus had learned long ago that impossible was just another word for challenging. The radio crackled to life in his ear. "Alpha Team, this is Base. Any sign of the missing reconnaissance team?" The voice of Commander Phillips cut through the static, heavy with concern. Marcus pressed the radio button on his vest. "Negative, sir. We've covered 12 clicks of rough terrain. No visual contact, no radio signals, nothing." He paused, looking at the faces of his men. Each one showed the same determination mixed with exhaustion that he felt in his bones. "But we're not giving up." The story began 5 days earlier when a 4-man SEAL reconnaissance team had gone dark during a routine surveillance mission in enemy territory. Their last known position was somewhere in these unforgiving mountains, where caves and crevices could hide an army. The terrain was brutal, with jagged rocks that could slice through boots and sudden drops that appeared without warning. Marcus had volunteered his team for the search and rescue mission without hesitation. The missing men weren't just fellow soldiers, they were brothers. In the military, you never left anyone behind, no matter what the cost. That code was written in blood and honor, passed down through generations of warriors who understood that trust was the foundation of everything they did. His team consisted of 6 experienced operators, each handpicked for their skills and unwavering loyalty. There was Rodriguez, the medic whose steady hands had saved more lives than anyone could count. Jackson, the communications expert who could make contact with base camp from the bottom of a canyon. Williams, the demolition specialist whose calm demeanor hid an explosive expertise. Thompson, the sniper whose eagle eyes could spot movement from impossible distances. And finally, Peterson, the youngest member of the team whose enthusiasm reminded Marcus of himself 20 years ago. They had started their search at dawn on the first day, moving in a careful formation through territory that belonged to no one and everyone. The mountains held secrets, and not all of them were friendly. Intel reports suggested enemy forces were operating in the area, making every step potentially dangerous. But danger was something these men had made peace with long ago. The first day yielded nothing but sore feet and empty radio frequencies. They had called out on emergency channels, searched every visible cave, and followed tracks that led nowhere. As night fell, they made camp in a defensive position, taking turns on watch while trying to grab a few hours of rest on the hard ground. Marcus lay on his back, staring up at stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear mountain air. He thought about the missing team leader, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a tough-as-nails officer who had earned the respect of every man under her command. She was the kind of soldier who led from the front, never asking her men to do anything she wouldn't do herself. The thought of her and her team trapped somewhere in these mountains made sleep impossible. The second day brought new challenges as they moved deeper into hostile territory. The landscape grew more treacherous, with loose rocks that could trigger avalanches and narrow paths that forced them to move single file. They found traces of human passage, old campfire remains, and disturbed vegetation, but nothing recent enough to give them hope. It was Rodriguez who found the first real clue. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks near a water source, he discovered a small piece of torn fabric that matched the desert camouflage pattern of SEAL uniforms. The fabric was fresh, no more than a few days old, and it had been deliberately placed where someone might find it. "They're alive," Marcus said, examining the fabric carefully, "and they're smart enough to leave us a trail." The discovery energized the team like a shot of adrenaline. They expanded their search pattern, looking for more signs, more clues that might lead them to their missing brothers and sister. The terrain continued to test them, with sudden weather changes that brought freezing rain followed by scorching heat. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that somewhere ahead, 4 of their own were counting on them. On the 3rd day, they found the second clue. Scratched into a rock face in a spot protected from wind and rain was a series of marks that looked random to the untrained eye. But Jackson recognized them immediately as tactical symbols. A coded message that provided coordinates and indicated the team was moving north under duress. "They're being hunted," Jackson reported grimly. "These markings suggest they're trying to evade capture while moving toward the extraction point." The extraction point was still 15 miles away through some of the most difficult terrain in the region. If the missing team was injured or compromised, they might not make it without help. Marcus made the decision to split his team, sending half to the extraction point while he led the others deeper into the mountains to continue the direct search. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and the paths more dangerous. Peterson, despite his youth and enthusiasm, began to struggle with the altitude and the punishing pace. But when Marcus suggested he stay behind with the radio, the young soldier's jaw set with determination. "Sir, I didn't come this far to quit now," Peterson said, shouldering his pack with renewed strength. "Those SEALs would do the same for us." It was true, and Marcus felt a surge of pride in his team. This was what separated elite military units from regular forces, this absolute commitment to each other that transcended personal comfort or safety. They were more than soldiers. They were family, bound by shared hardship and mutual trust. The 4th day dawned gray and threatening, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather in the mountains could change from manageable to deadly in minutes, and Marcus knew they were running out of time. If a major storm hit, it could trap them for days or even weeks, and by then it might be too late for the missing team. They had been moving for less than an hour when Thompson, scouting ahead, suddenly raised his fist in the signal to halt. Everyone froze, weapons ready, as the sniper carefully made his way back to the main group. "Movement ahead," Thompson whispered. "Looks like a small patrol. Armed but not military. Could be the local militia we were warned about." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The presence of hostile forces in the search area complicated everything. If the missing SEAL team had been captured, a direct assault might be necessary. But if they were still evading and hiding, any firefight could draw unwanted attention to their position. He made a quick, tactical decision. "We go around," he whispered to his team. "Our mission is search and rescue, not engagement. We can't help the missing team if we're pinned down in a firefight." They spent 2 precious hours moving carefully around the patrol's position, using natural terrain features to mask their movement. The delay was frustrating, but Marcus knew that patience often meant the difference between mission success and disaster. His father, a veteran of 3 wars, had taught him that the best soldiers were not those who fought the hardest, but those who fought the smartest. When they finally cleared the patrol area and resumed their search, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. What had started as a few scattered clouds was building into a serious storm system. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of worse weather to come. They found the 3rd clue just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Hidden in a crevice between 2 large boulders was a standard military survival mirror, the kind every SEAL carried for emergency signaling. But this one had been deliberately broken, with pieces arranged in a pattern that pointed northeast, toward a series of caves visible on the mountainside above them. "They're close," Marcus said, studying the signal through his binoculars. "That cave system is maybe 2 clicks from here." The rain was falling harder now, turning the rocky ground slippery and dangerous. But the team pressed on, knowing that the same storm that made their movement difficult might also provide cover for the final approach to wherever their missing comrades were hiding. As they climbed toward the caves, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that came before potential contact. After 4 days of searching, they were finally close to answers. But in this business, answers didn't always come with happy endings. He had seen too many rescue missions that ended in recovery operations instead. The caves loomed ahead, dark openings in the mountainside that could hide secrets or shelter hope. Marcus checked his weapon one final time and signaled his team to prepare for whatever they might find in the darkness ahead. The rain hammered against the rocky mountainside as Marcus and his team approached the cave system. Water ran in rivulets down the stone face, making every step treacherous. The storm had arrived with the fury of nature unleashed, turning what should have been a careful approach into a desperate race against time. Marcus raised his night vision goggles, scanning the cave entrances for any sign of movement. There were at least 6 openings visible from their position, creating a maze of possibilities. The missing SEAL team could be in any one of them, or they could have moved on entirely, using the caves only as a temporary shelter. Thompson, moving with the silent precision of a trained sniper, had already positioned himself to provide overwatch from a rocky outcrop 50 meters away. His rifle scope swept methodically across each cave entrance, looking for any threat that might emerge. In this game of life and death, having eyes on target was the difference between a successful rescue and walking into an ambush. Rodriguez checked his medical supplies for the 3rd time, his experienced hands moving automatically over bandages, morphine, and emergency trauma equipment. After 20 years as a combat medic, he had learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. His face was calm, but Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set in preparation for whatever they might find. The first cave they approached was shallow, barely more than an indentation in the rock face. But Jackson's trained eye spotted something immediately. Scratched into the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for, were more tactical markings. This time the message was clear. Moved deeper, too injured, being tracked. Marcus felt his heart sink. Too injured meant serious problems. In this terrain, with hostile forces potentially closing in, carrying wounded teammates would slow the missing team to a crawl. They might have been forced to take shelter in one of the deeper caves, unable to continue their movement toward the extraction point. The second cave entrance was larger, disappearing into darkness that their flashlights couldn't penetrate. As they prepared to enter, Peterson suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm, his young face tense with concentration. "Sir," he whispered, "do you hear that?" Marcus held his breath, straining to listen over the sound of rain and wind. At first there was nothing, just the hollow echo of water dripping in the cave depths. But then he heard it too, a faint sound that made his pulse quicken. It was the distinctive pattern of emergency tapping, the Morse code signal that every military unit learned for situations exactly like this. Tap, 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 tap. The universal distress signal, repeating every 30 seconds from somewhere deep in the cave system. "That's them," Marcus whispered, feeling a surge of hope mixed with urgency. "Jackson, get on the radio. Tell base we have potential contact." They moved into the cave with weapons ready, using hand signals to communicate in the darkness. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder as they moved deeper into the mountain. The cave system was more extensive than it had appeared from outside, with multiple passages branching off in different directions. The sound was coming from the left passage, down a narrow tunnel that forced them to move single file. Marcus took point, his rifle light cutting through the darkness ahead. The walls were rough and uneven, carved by countless years of water flow, and the ceiling was low enough that they had to duck in places. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, they emerged into a larger chamber, and there, huddled against the far wall, were 4 figures in desert camouflage. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell looked up as their lights found her, her face breaking into a smile despite the obvious pain etched in her features. "About time you guys showed up," she said, her voice hoarse but strong. "We were starting to think you'd forgotten about us." Rodriguez was already moving, his medic instincts taking over as he assessed the condition of the missing team. Lieutenant Mitchell had a makeshift bandage around her left arm, darkened with dried blood. Beside her, Sergeant First Class Davis was unconscious, his leg obviously broken and splinted with pieces of equipment. The other two team members, Corporal Martinez and Petty Officer Chang, were alert but showed signs of exhaustion and dehydration. "What's your status, Lieutenant?" Marcus asked, while Rodriguez began a more thorough medical examination of the injured soldiers. "We were compromised on day 2, Mitchell explained, accepting a water bottle from Peterson. "Local militia spotted us during surveillance and opened fire. Davis took a round in the leg, and I caught some shrapnel from a grenade. We managed to break contact and make it to these caves, but they've been hunting us ever since." She gestured toward the cave entrance they had just come through. "We've been moving deeper into the system each day, trying to stay ahead of search patrols. But Davis is getting worse, and we're running out of options." Rodriguez looked up from his examination, his expression serious. "Davis needs immediate evacuation. That leg wound is infected and he's showing signs of sepsis. We need to get him to a field hospital within 6 hours, or we're going to lose him." The situation had suddenly become much more complicated. They were deep in hostile territory, at least a day's hard travel from the extraction point, with a critically wounded soldier who couldn't walk. The storm outside was getting worse, making helicopter evacuation impossible. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the caves, enemy forces were still searching. Marcus felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every decision he made now would determine whether they all made it home or whether this rescue mission became a recovery operation. He had been in situations like this before, but the pressure never got easier. "Options?" he asked his team, knowing that the best solutions often came from the collective wisdom of experienced soldiers rather than individual command decisions. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio from his overwatch position. "Sir, I've got movement on the approach route. Looks like a patrol of 6 to 8 hostiles moving this way. They'll be at the cave entrance in 20 minutes. The situation had just become critical. They were trapped in a cave system with wounded soldiers, a storm raging outside, and hostile forces closing in on their position. But Marcus had not survived 20 years of military operations by panicking under pressure. "Jackson, get on the satellite radio," he ordered. "Tell base we need immediate emergency extraction at grid reference 3847. Tell them we have wounded and are under immediate threat." "Rodriguez, how mobile is Davis?" "With enough morphine and a stretcher, we can move him," the medic replied. "But it won't be fast, and it won't be quiet." Marcus studied the cave map that Martinez had been maintaining during their 3 days of hiding. The system was more extensive than he had realized, with multiple entrances and several larger chambers. But more importantly, it connected to another cave system on the opposite side of the mountain. "There," he said, pointing to the map. "If we can get through this passage, we come out on the north face. That puts us within 2 clicks of the emergency extraction point." Lieutenant Mitchell struggled to her feet, despite Rodriguez's protests. "That passage floods during heavy rain," she warned. "We checked it on the first day. It might not be passable now." Outside, lightning illuminated the cave entrance, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. The storm was directly overhead now, and water was already beginning to flow more heavily through the cave system. "It's our only option," Marcus decided. "We can't fight our way out past that patrol, not with wounded. And we can't stay here and wait for them to find us." Williams, who had been quietly studying the cave structure, spoke up. "If that passage does flood, we'll need to move fast. I can rig a small charge to collapse the tunnel behind us, buy us some time if the hostiles try to follow." It was a desperate plan, but desperation sometimes bred the kind of innovation that saved lives. Marcus looked at each member of his team, seeing the same determination in their faces that he felt in his heart. They were not going to leave anyone behind, no matter what it took. Rodriguez finished stabilizing Davis for transport. using their combined medical supplies to create an improvised stretcher from equipment and uniform material. The unconscious soldier stirred briefly, his fever-bright eyes focusing on Marcus with difficulty.
"Don't leave me behind,"
Davis whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus knelt beside the stretcher, his hand on the wounded soldier's shoulder.
"Not happening, son.
We're all going home together." The sound of voices echoed from the main cave entrance, distant but growing closer. The patrol had arrived ahead of schedule, and they were already beginning their search of the cave system. Marcus could hear them calling to each other in a language he didn't recognize, but their intent was clear enough. "Time to move," he whispered to his team. They lifted Davis's stretcher as carefully as possible and began moving toward the passage that would either lead them to safety or trap them in a flooded tomb. The wounded soldier bit down on a piece of equipment to muffle any sounds of pain, showing the same courage that had made him a SEAL in the first place. The passage was narrow and sloping downward, with water already ankle-deep and rising. Mitchell led the way, her knowledge of the cave system invaluable despite her injured arm. Behind them, Williams placed his charges and set the timer, giving them a 10-minute head start before the explosion would seal their route. As they moved deeper into the mountain, the sound of the pursuing patrol grew fainter, replaced by the ominous rush of water flowing through stone channels carved by centuries of flash floods. Marcus tried not to think about what would happen if the passage completely flooded before they reached the other side. In the military, you focused on the mission, not on the 100 ways it could go wrong. The water was knee-deep now, cold and fast-moving, making every step a battle for balance while carrying the stretcher. Davis had lost consciousness again, which was probably a mercy given the pain of being transported through such difficult terrain. Rodriguez stayed close to the stretcher, monitoring vital signs and adjusting the makeshift IV he had rigged using their emergency supplies. Behind them, the explosion echoed through the mountain like distant thunder, followed by the rumble of falling rock. Williams had done his job perfectly, sealing the passage and buying them precious time. But time was still their enemy, along with rising water, exhaustion, and the critical condition of their wounded teammate. The water was chest-deep now and rising fast. Marcus could feel the current tugging at his legs, threatening to sweep them all downstream into the darkness of the flooded cave system. The stretcher carrying Davis had become almost impossible to manage, with 4 men struggling to keep it level while fighting against the rushing water. Lieutenant Mitchell, despite her injured arm, had taken point position and was feeling along the cave wall for the passage that should lead them to the north face exit. Her face was pale with pain and exhaustion, but her voice remained steady as she called back directions to the team. 30 meters ahead, she shouted over the roar of the water. There should be a sharp turn to the right, then an upward slope. Rodriguez was having difficulty keeping Davis's head above water while monitoring his vital signs. The wounded soldier's condition was deteriorating rapidly, his fever spiking despite the cold water surrounding them. Every minute they spent in the flooded passage was a minute closer to losing him entirely. Peterson, the youngest member of the team, suddenly stumbled and went under. The current immediately grabbed him, pulling him toward a side passage that disappeared into complete darkness. Without hesitation, Jackson lunged forward, catching the young soldier's equipment harness and hauling him back to the group. "Stay together," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Nobody gets separated. We all make it out, or none of us do." It was the code they all lived by, the promise that bound them together as more than just soldiers. In the worst moments, when everything seemed impossible, that promise was what kept them moving forward. They were not just fighting for themselves anymore, they were fighting for each other. The sharp turn Mitchell had mentioned appeared suddenly in their lights, and beyond it, they could see the blessed sight of an upward slope. The water level dropped to waist-deep, then knee-deep, as they climbed toward what they hoped was the exit. Davis stirred on the stretcher, his eyes opening briefly to focus on Marcus. "How much farther?" the wounded soldier whispered. "Almost there," Marcus replied, though he had no idea if that was true. "Just hold on a little longer." The passage opened into another chamber, this one filled with fresh air that carried the scent of rain and vegetation. Somewhere ahead was the outside world, freedom from the mountain that had nearly become their tomb. But they were not safe yet. Lieutenant Mitchell collapsed against the cave wall, her strength finally giving out. The infected wound on her arm had drained her reserves, and the stress of leading them through the flooded passage had pushed her beyond her limits. Rodriguez immediately moved to check her condition while still maintaining watch over Davis. "I'm okay," she insisted, though her pale face and labored breathing told a different story. "Just need a minute to catch my breath." Marcus made a command decision. "Peterson, Williams, take point and find the exit. Jackson, get on the radio and see if you can raise base camp. We need that extraction more than ever." As his team moved with practiced efficiency, Marcus knelt beside the two wounded soldiers. These were his people, his responsibility, and their condition was a weight he carried in his chest, like a physical pain. In 20 years of military service, he had learned that command meant making impossible choices, but it never got easier. Williams called back from the passage ahead. "Exit secured, sir. We're on the north face, about 2 clicks from the extraction point, but we've got a problem." Marcus felt his heart sink. There always seemed to be another problem, another obstacle between them and safety. "What is it?" "Weather's getting worse out here. Visibility near zero, wind gusts that could knock a man over. And sir, I can see lights moving down in the valley. Looks like search parties, multiple groups, all converging on this area." The enemy forces had figured out their escape route and were moving to cut them off. Marcus had hoped the collapsed passage would buy them more time, but their pursuers were more determined and better organized than he had anticipated. The storm that had helped conceal their movement was now working against them, grounding any possibility of helicopter extraction. Jackson's radio crackled with static and broken transmissions. "Base camp is trying to reach us," he reported, "but the storm is interfering with communications. I'm getting fragments about extraction being delayed due to weather." They were on their own, with 2 critically wounded soldiers, hostile forces closing in, and extraction uncertain. But Marcus had not brought his team this far to give up now. The easy choice would be to find a defensible position and wait for help. The right choice was to keep moving, to fight their way to safety through whatever obstacles stood in their path. "We move to the extraction point," he decided. "Whatever's waiting for us there, we deal with it when we get there." Rodriguez had stabilized both wounded soldiers as much as possible with their remaining medical supplies. Davis was conscious but weak, his infected leg wound requiring immediate surgical attention that they couldn't provide. Mitchell was mobile but needed support, her injured arm making it difficult to maintain balance on the rough terrain. They emerged from the cave into a world transformed by the storm. Rain drove horizontally across the mountainside, reducing visibility to mere meters. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, brief moments that revealed the treacherous path ahead. The extraction point was somewhere beyond the ridge that rose before them like a wall of darkness. Thompson had remained at his overwatch position throughout their underground journey, and his voice came through the radio with welcome news. "Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. I've been tracking the search parties. They're moving slowly due to the weather, but they're organized. Estimate 45 minutes before they reach your position." 45 minutes to cover 2 kilometers of mountain terrain while carrying wounded soldiers in the worst weather any of them had seen. It should have been impossible, but Marcus had stopped believing in impossible 4 days ago when they started this mission. They moved out in tactical formation with Peterson and Williams taking point while Jackson and Rodriguez carried Davis on the improvised stretcher. Marcus stayed close to Lieutenant Mitchell, ready to provide support if her strength gave out completely. Behind them, the cave entrance disappeared into the storm, closing the door on the nightmare they had just escaped. The ridge was steeper than it had appeared from below, with loose rock that shifted underfoot and exposed sections where the wind threatened to tear them from the mountainside. They climbed in single file, connected by rope to prevent anyone from falling into the darkness below. Each step was a victory against gravity, weather, and the clock that was counting down to their capture, or worse. Peterson, climbing ahead of the main group, suddenly raised his fist in the halt signal. Everyone froze, weapons ready, as the young soldier pointed toward a rocky outcrop ahead. Through the rain and darkness, they could see the faint glow of lights, moving with the purposeful pattern of a search patrol. Marcus felt time compressing around them like a closing fist. The extraction point was just beyond that outcrop, but hostile forces had arrived first. They were trapped between the search parties below and the enemy patrol above, with wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. But in that moment of crisis, Marcus remembered something his father had told him years ago during his first deployment. Son, being a hero isn't about being fearless. It's about being scared and doing what's right anyway. He looked at his team, these men who had volunteered for an impossible mission and followed him into the depths of hell itself. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and facing odds that any reasonable person would call hopeless. But they were still here, still fighting, still refusing to give up on their fallen comrades. "Williams," he whispered into his radio. "How much explosive do you have left?" "Enough for one good distraction, sir." "Thompson, can you create a diversion from your position?" "Affirmative. I can draw their attention away from the extraction point." "Jackson, keep trying to raise base camp. Tell them we're coming in hot." The plan formed in Marcus's mind with the clarity that came in moments of absolute necessity. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was their only chance. They would create chaos, use the storm and darkness as cover, and fight their way to the extraction point through sheer determination and brotherhood. "Listen up," he told his team. "We've come too far to quit now. Those search parties down there think they have us trapped, but they don't know who they're dealing with. We're going home today, all of us, together." Williams placed his final charges on the outcrop where the enemy patrol was positioned, while Thompson began engaging targets from his distant overwatch position. The night erupted in explosions and gunfire, creating the confusion they needed to make their final push. They moved through the chaos like ghosts, carrying their wounded comrades toward the extraction point that represented hope and home. Enemy forces fired blindly into the storm, unable to locate targets in the darkness and rain. The diversion was working, but they were running out of time before someone realized what was happening. The extraction point was a small clearing on a flat section of ridge, marked by emergency strobes that were barely visible through the storm. As they approached, Jackson's radio suddenly came alive with clear communications. "Alpha Team, this is Extraction Bird. We're inbound, ETA 3 minutes. Be advised, weather conditions are marginal for landing." Marcus felt a surge of hope that threatened to overwhelm his careful control. After 4 days of searching, fighting, and surviving, they were moments away from safety. But 3 minutes might as well be 3 hours with enemy forces closing in on their position. They reached the extraction point just as the sound of rotor blades began cutting through the storm. The helicopter appeared like a mechanical angel, its searchlight sweeping the landing zone as the pilot fought against wind gusts that could slam the aircraft into the mountainside. Rodriguez and Jackson carried Davis toward the helicopter, while Marcus helped Lieutenant Mitchell across the rocky ground. Behind them, Williams and Peterson provided rear security, their weapons trained on the approaches where enemy forces might appear at any moment. The helicopter touched down in a controlled crash, its skids scraping against rock as the pilot struggled to maintain position in the impossible wind conditions. The crew chief jumped out to help load the wounded soldiers, his movements efficient despite the chaos surrounding them. Davis was loaded first, with Rodriguez climbing aboard to continue medical treatment during the flight. Lieutenant Mitchell followed, her face showing relief mixed with exhaustion. One by one, the team boarded the aircraft that would carry them away from the nightmare of the past 4 days. Marcus was the last aboard, as commanders should be. As he climbed into the helicopter, he looked back at the mountain that had tested them all beyond their limits. Somewhere in those peaks and valleys, enemy forces were still searching for the Americans who had vanished into the storm. They would never know how close they had come to capturing or killing some of the finest soldiers in the world. The helicopter lifted off into the storm, carrying 8 soldiers who had proven once again that the bonds of brotherhood could overcome any obstacle. In the medical bay, Rodriguez worked over Davis with steady hands, his patient's vital signs stabilizing for the first time in days. Lieutenant Mitchell sat quietly, holding the hand of the soldier whose life they had just saved. As they flew toward the base hospital where real doctors would take over Davis's care, Marcus reflected on the mission that had brought them to this moment. They had been sent to find 4 missing soldiers and had discovered something much more valuable. They had proven to themselves and each other that the promise to never leave anyone behind was not just words, but a sacred commitment written in blood and honor. 3 weeks later, in a hospital room hundreds of miles from those hostile mountains, Sergeant First Class Davis took his first steps on a leg that doctors had thought might need to be amputated. Lieutenant Mitchell had returned to duty with a commendation for leadership under impossible circumstances. The entire rescue team had been decorated for valor, though none of them thought they had done anything extraordinary. Marcus stood at the hospital window, watching Davis work with a physical therapist in the courtyard below. The young soldier's determination was evident in every difficult step, his refusal to give up a mirror of the spirit that had carried them all through those 4 days in hell. "Sir?" Peterson appeared in the doorway, no longer the uncertain young soldier who had volunteered for the mission, but a tested warrior who had proven himself in the worst conditions imaginable. "The team is gathering for Rodriguez's retirement ceremony," Peterson continued. "He asked me to make sure you were there." Marcus smiled, remembering the medic whose steady hands and unshakable calm had kept Davis alive through the long journey to safety. After 25 years of military service, Rodriguez had decided it was time to go home to his family. He had earned that retirement through decades of saving lives and serving with distinction. "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied, taking one last look at Davis in the courtyard below. The soldier was laughing at something his therapist had said, his face bright with the joy of someone who had been given a second chance at life. As they walked toward the ceremony, Marcus thought about the title someone had given their story. Beneath dirt and blood, the SEALs unearthed the hero who wouldn't give up. But he knew the truth was more complex than any headline could capture. They had not found just one hero in those mountains. They had discovered that heroism was not the property of any individual, but something that emerged from the bonds between people who refused to abandon each other, no matter what the cost. In the end, that was what made them all heroes. Not the medals or the commendations or the stories that would be told about their mission. It was the simple truth that when the moment came to choose between the easy path and the right path, they had chosen each other. And in a world where such choices were increasingly rare, that made all the difference. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by the soldiers who had shared those 4 days of hell and emerged stronger for the experience. As Rodriguez received his final salute from the men whose lives he had saved countless times, Marcus felt the familiar pride that came with serving alongside the finest people he had ever known. Later, as the sun set behind the base, the team gathered one final time in the hospital cafeteria. Davis, still using crutches but mobile and improving daily, raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To the team that never gave up," he said, his voice strong despite everything he had endured. "To the team that never gave up," they echoed. And in those words was the promise they had made to each other years ago and had proven true in the mountains where heroes are forged from ordinary people who do extraordinary things for each other. The story would be told and retold in the years to come, but for the men who had lived it, the real meaning was simpler and more profound. They had kept their promise. They had brought everyone home. And in a world full of uncertainty and darkness, that was enough to light the way forward for as long as any of them lived.